Chapter 16. In the Jolly Cricketers. The Jolly Cricketers is just at the bottom of the hill where the tram lines begin. The barman talked of horses with an anemic cabman, while a black-bearded man in grey ate biscuit and cheese, drank beer, and conversed with a policeman off-duty. "What's the shouting about?" said the anemic cabman. Somebody ran by outside. "Fire, perhaps," said the barman. Footsteps approached, running heavily. The door was pushed open violently, and Marvel, whipping and disheveled, rushed in, made a convulsive turn, and attempted to shut the door. "Coming!" he bawled, and his voice shrieked with terror. "He's coming! The invisible man! After me! Help! Help! Help!" "Shut the doors," said the policeman. "Who's coming? What's the matter?" He went to the door, and it slammed. "Let me go inside," said Marvel, staggering and weeping, but still clutching the books. "Let me go inside. Lock me in, somewhere. I tell you he is after me. I escaped. He said he'd kill me, and he will." "You're safe," said the man with the black beard. "The door's shut. What's it all about?" "Let me go inside," said Marvel, and shrieked aloud as a blow suddenly made the fastened door shiver. There was a hurried rapping and a shouting outside. "Hello?" cried the policeman. "Who's there?" Mr. Marvel cried. "He'll kill me. He's got a knife or something. Help me." "Come in here," said the barman, and he held up the flap of the bar. "Don't open the door," Mr. Marvel screamed. "Please don't open the door. Where shall I hide?" This invisible man, then?" asked the man with the black beard. "I guess it's about time to see him." The window of the inn was suddenly smashed in, and there was a screaming and running to and fro in the street. The policeman had been trying to see who was at the door. "It's him," he said. The barman stood in front of the bar parlor door, which was now locked on Mr. Marvel, stared at the smashed window, and came round to the two other men. Everything was suddenly quiet. "I wish I had my truncheon," said the policeman, going to the door. "When we open the door, he will come in. We can't stop him." "Don't hasten to open that door," said the anemic cabman, anxiously. "Draw the bolts," said the man with the black beard. "And if he comes—" He showed a revolver in his hand. "That won't do," said the policeman. "That's murder." "I know what country I'm in," said the man with the beard. "I'm going to let off at his legs. Draw the bolts." "Not at my neck," said the barman. "Very well," said the man with the black beard, and drew the bolts himself. Barman, cabman, and policeman looked at each other. "Come in," said the bearded man, facing the unbolted doors with his pistol behind him. No one came in. The door remained closed. 5 minutes afterwards, when a second cabman came in, they were still waiting, and an anxious face peered out of the bar parlor and asked, "Are all the doors of the house shut? He's going round, prowling round. He's as artful as the devil." "Good Lord," said the barman. "There's the back door." He looked about him helplessly. The bar parlor door slammed, and they heard the key turn. "There is the yard door and the private door." "The yard door?" He rushed out of the bar. In a minute he reappeared with a carving knife in his hand. "The yard door was open," he said. "He may be in the house now," said the first cabman. "He's not in the kitchen," said the barman. "There are two women there, and they don't think that he's come in. They haven't noticed anything." "Have you fastened it?" asked the first cabman. "Of course," said the barman. The man with the beard replaced his revolver, and the flap of the bar was shut down and the bolt clicked, and then with a tremendous thud the catch of the door snapped and the bar parlor door burst open. They heard Marvel squeal like a leveret, and they were clambering over the bar to his rescue. The bearded man's revolver cracked, and the looking-glass at the back of the parlor starred. As the barman entered the room, he saw Marvel, curiously crumpled up and struggling against the door that led to the yard and kitchen. The door flew open while the barman hesitated, and Marvel was dragged into the kitchen. Marvel was then forced to the kitchen door, and the bolts were drawn. Then the policeman rushed in, followed by one of the cabmen, gripped the wrist of the invisible hand that collared Marvel, was hit in the face, and went back. The door opened. Then the cabman collared something. "I got him," said the cabman. "Here he is." Mr. Marvel, released, suddenly dropped to the ground and made an attempt to crawl behind the legs of the fighting men. The voice of the invisible man was heard for the first time, yelling out sharply as the policeman trod on his foot. Then he cried out passionately, and his fists flew round. The cabman suddenly whooped. The door into the bar parlor from the kitchen slammed and covered Mr. Marvel's retreat. The men in the kitchen found themselves struggling with empty air. "Where's he gone?" cried the man with the beard. "Out?" "This way," said the policeman, stepping into the yard and stopping. "I'll show him," shouted the man with the black beard, and 5 bullets had followed one another. As he fired, the man with the beard moved his hand in a horizontal curve. A silence followed. 5 bullets, said the man with the black beard. 4 aces and a joker. Get a lantern, someone. Let's find his body. Chapter 17. Dr. Kemp's Visitor. Dr. Kemp had continued writing in his study until he heard the shots. Crack, crack, crack. They came one after the other. "Hello?" said Dr. Kemp, putting his pen into his mouth again and listening. "Who's shooting in Burdock? What are these asses doing now?" He went to the south window, threw it up, and stared down. "Looks like a crowd," he said, "by the cricketers," and remained watching. After 5 minutes, Dr. Kemp sighed, pulled down the window again, and returned to his writing desk. In an hour after this, the front door bell rang. Dr. Kemp sat listening. He heard the servant answer the door, and waited for her feet on the staircase, but she did not come. "I wonder what that was," said Dr. Kemp. He got up, went downstairs from his study, rang, and called the housemaid. She appeared in the hall below. "Was that a letter?" he asked. "Only a ring, sir. Just a ring, that's all," she answered. He went back to his study. It was 2:00 before Dr. Kemp had finished his work for the night. He rose, yawned, and went downstairs to bed. Then he noticed that he was thirsty. He took a candle and went down to the dining room. He noticed a dark spot on the linoleum near the mat at the foot of the stairs. He went on upstairs, and then it suddenly occurred to him to ask himself what the spot on the linoleum might be. He went back to the hole and, bending down, touched the spot. Without any great surprise, he found it was blood. He returned upstairs, looking about him. Then he saw something and stopped astonished. The door handle of his own room was blood-stained. He looked at his own hand. It was quite clean, and then he remembered that the door of his room had been open when he came down from his study, and that consequently he had not touched the handle at all. He went straight into his room. His glance, wandering inquisitively, fell on the bed. The sheet had been torn. On the further side, the bedclothes were depressed, as if someone had been recently sitting there. Then he had an odd impression that he had heard a low voice say, "Good heavens, Kemp!" But Dr. Kemp was no believer in voices. Was that really a voice? He looked about again, but noticed nothing. Then he distinctly heard a movement across the room, near the wash-hand stand. All men, however highly educated, retain some superstitions. He closed the door of the room and came forward to the dressing table. Suddenly, he saw a blood-stained bandage hanging in the air, between him and the wash-hand stand. Suddenly a voice spoke quite close to him. "Kemp," said the voice. "Eh?" said Kemp with his mouth open. "Keep your nerve," said the voice. "I'm an invisible man." Kemp made no answer for a space, simply stared at the bandage. "Invisible man," he said. "I am an invisible man," repeated the voice. The story he had ridiculed only that morning rushed through Kemp's brain. "Thought it was all a lie," he said. "Oh, but this is nonsense. It's some trick." He stepped forward suddenly, and his hand met invisible fingers. "Keep your nerve, Kemp, for God's sake. I want help badly. Stop!" The hand gripped his arm. "Kemp!" cried the voice. "Kemp, keep your nerve!" And the grip tightened. Kemp was suddenly flung upon the bed. He opened his mouth to shout, and the corner of the sheet was thrust between his teeth. "Listen to reason, will you?" said the invisible man. "By heaven, lie still, you fool!" bawled the invisible man in Kemp's ear. "If you shout, I'll smash your face," said the invisible man, relieving Kemp's mouth. "I'm an invisible man. It's no foolishness and no magic. I really am an invisible man. And I want your help. I don't want to hurt you, but if you behave like a fool, I must. Don't you remember me, Kemp? We were studying together. Do you remember the university college? Let me get up, said Kemp, and let me sit quiet for a minute. He sat up. I am Griffin of University College, and I have made myself invisible. I am just an ordinary man, a man you have known, made invisible. Griffin? Said Kemp. Griffin, answered the voice. A student 6 feet high, with a pink and white face and red eyes, who won the medal for chemistry. I'm confused, said Kemp. Why Griffin? I am Griffin. Kemp thought. It's horrible, he said. But what devilry must happen to make a man invisible? It's no devilry. It's an intelligible process. It's horrible, said Kemp. But how? It's horrible enough. But I'm wounded and in pain and tired. Great God! Kemp, give me some food and drink, and let me sit down here. Kemp stared at the bandage as it moved across the room, and then saw a basket chair dragged across the floor and come to rest near the bed. Kemp rubbed his eyes. This is more interesting than ghosts, he said and laughed stupidly. That's better. Thank heaven you're getting sensible. We're silly, said Kemp and knuckled his eyes. Give me some whiskey. I'm near dead. Where are you? There. All right. Whiskey, here. Where shall I give it to you? The chair creaked and Kemp felt the glass drawn away from him. It stopped 20 inches above the front edge of the seat of the chair. He stared at it in perplexity. This must be hypnotism. You just tell me that you are invisible, and I believe you. Nonsense, said the voice. Listen to me. I'm starving, and the night is chilly to a man without clothes. Food, said Kemp. Yes, said the invisible man. Have you a dressing gown? Kemp walked to a wardrobe and produced a dressing gown. It was taken from him. It hung for a moment in the air, fluttered weirdly, and sat down in his chair. Trousers, socks, slippers, said the unseen curtly. And food. Anything, but this is the strangest thing I have seen in my life. He went downstairs to take some clothes. He came back with some cold cutlets and bread as well, and placed them before his guest. The cutlet hung in the air with a sound of gnawing. Invisible, said Kemp and sat down on a bedroom chair. Of all the strange and wonderful... Exactly, but it's really strange that I found your house. My first luck. Anyhow, I meant to sleep in this house tonight. My blood gets visible as it coagulates, I see. It's only the living tissue I've changed, but only for as long as I'm alive. I've been in the house for 3 hours. But how's it done? Began Kemp in a tone of exasperation. The whole business. It's unreasonable from beginning to end. Quite reasonable, said the invisible man. Perfectly reasonable. He took the whiskey bottle. Kemp stared at the devouring dressing gown. What about the shots? Kemp asked. How did the shooting begin? There was a fool, curse him, who tried to steal my money, and he has done so. Is he invisible too? No. Well? Can I have some more to eat before I tell you all that? I'm hungry, and you want me to tell stories. Kemp got up. You didn't do any shooting? He asked. Not me, said the visitor. Some fool I'd never seen fired at random. They got scared. They all got scared at me. Curse them. I want to eat more, Kemp. I'll see what there is to eat downstairs, said Kemp. Not much, I'm afraid. After he had done eating, the invisible man demanded a cigar. It was strange to see him smoking. His mouth and throat became visible when smoke cast. I'm lucky to meet you, Kemp, he said. You must help me. I suffered a lot. But we will work together, let me tell you. He drank more whiskey. Kemp got up and looked about him. You haven't changed much, Kemp, these dozen years. I must tell you, we will work together. But how was it all done? Said Kemp. For God's sake, let me smoke in peace for a little while, and then I will begin to tell you. But the story was not told that night. The invisible man's wrist was growing painful. He was feverish and exhausted. He spoke in fragments of marvel. His voice grew angry. He was afraid of me. I could see that he was afraid of me, said the invisible man. He wanted to escape. What a fool I was. The cur. I should have killed him. "Where did you get the money?" asked Camp abruptly. "I can't tell you tonight," said the invisible man. He leant forward, supporting his invisible head on invisible hands. "Camp," he said, "I have not slept for 3 days. I must sleep soon." "Well, have my room. Have this room." "But how can I sleep? If I sleep, he will get away." "Ah, what does it matter? Is your wound serious?" asked Camp abruptly. "Not at all. Oh God, how I want sleep." "Why not?" "Because I don't want to be caught by my fellow men," he said slowly. Camp started. "Fool that I am," said the invisible man. "I've put the idea into your head." Chapter 18. The Invisible Man Sleeps. The invisible man examined the 2 windows of the bedroom. Outside, the night was very quiet and still. Then he examined the keys of the bedroom and the 2 dressing room doors. Finally, he expressed himself satisfied. He stood on the hearth rug, and Camp heard the sound of a yawn. "I'm sorry," said the invisible man, "if I cannot tell you all that I have done tonight. But I am tired. It's horrible. But believe me, Camp, it is quite a possible thing. I have made a discovery. I meant to keep it to myself. I can't. I must have a partner. And you, we can do such things, and tomorrow. Now, Camp, I must sleep or perish." Camp stood in the middle of the room, staring at the headless garment. "I suppose I must leave you," he said. "It's incredible, but it's real. Is there anything more that I can do for you?" "Only bid me good night," said Griffin. "Good night," said Camp and shook an invisible hand. He walked to the door. Suddenly, the dressing gown walked quickly towards him. "Remember," said the dressing gown, "no attempts to hamper me or capture me. Or—" Camp's face changed a little. He closed the door softly behind him, and the key was turned upon him forthwith. "Am I dreaming? Has the world gone mad, or have I?" He laughed and put his hand to the locked door. "Barred out of my own bedroom," he said. He stared at the locked doors. "It's a fact," he said. "Undeniable fact. But—" He shook his head hopelessly, turned, and went downstairs. He lit the dining room lamp, got out a cigar, and began pacing the room. He began to talk to himself. Invisible. Is there such a thing as an invisible animal? In the sea, yes. Thousands, millions. All the microscopic things, the jellyfish. In the sea there are more things invisible than visible. I have never thought of that before. But in air? No, it can't be. But after all, why not? If a man was made of glass, he would still be visible. He walked out of the room and went into his little room and lit the gas there. It was a little room, and in it were the newspapers. The morning's paper lay carelessly opened and thrown aside. He took it, turned it over, and read the strange story from Iping. Camp read it swiftly. "Disguised," said Camp. "Hiding. No one knows about his misfortune. What does he want?" He dropped the paper. "Ah," he said. "Now we shall know the truth." He opened the paper. "An entire village in Sussex went mad," was the heading. "Good heavens," said Camp. He read it, then he dropped the paper and stared blankly in front of him. He caught up the papers again and reread the articles. But where did the tramp come from? Why the devil was he chasing a tramp? He sat down. "He's not only invisible," he said, "but he's mad. Homicidal mania." When dawn came, Camp was still pacing up and down, trying to grasp the incredible. He was too excited to sleep. His servants discovered him and were inclined to think that he had studied too much. He gave them extraordinary instructions to lay breakfast for 2, and then to confine themselves to the basement. Then he continued to pace the dining room until the morning's paper came. The happenings at the Jolly Cricketers were discussed, and the name of Marvel was mentioned. But Mr. Marvel had not said anything about the 3 books or the money. Camp sent his housemaid out to buy all the morning papers. "He's invisible," he said, "and his rage is growing to mania. He may do terrible things. And he's upstairs." What ought I to do? Will it be a treachery if I... No. He went to a little desk in the corner and began to write a note. Then he took an envelope and addressed it to Colonel Addy, Port Burdock. The Invisible Man awoke as Camp was doing this. He awoke in an evil temper, and Camp heard his feet rush suddenly across the bedroom overhead. Then a chair was flung over, and the glass was smashed. Camp hurried upstairs and rapped. Chapter 19. Certain First Principles. "What's the matter?" asked Camp when the Invisible Man admitted him. "Nothing," was the answer. "But the smash?" "Just irritability," said the Invisible Man. "I forgot my arm, and it hurts." "You're rather liable to that sort of thing." "I am." Camp walked across the room and picked up the fragments of broken glass. "The papers write about you," said Camp, standing up with the glass in his hand. "About that happened in Iping and down the hill. The world has become aware of its invisible citizen. But no one knows you are here." The Invisible Man swore. "The secret's out. I don't know what your plans are, but of course I'm ready to help you." The Invisible Man sat down on the bed. "There's breakfast upstairs," said Camp, speaking as easily as possible. Camp led the way up the narrow staircase to the Belvedere. "Before we can do anything else," said Camp, "I must understand a little more about this invisibility of yours." He sat down after one nervous glance out of the window. His doubts vanished as he looked across to where Griffin sat at the breakfast table, a headless, handless dressing gown, wiping unseen lips on a miraculously held serviette. "It's simple enough, and credible enough," said Griffin, putting the serviette aside and leaning the invisible head on an invisible hand. "No doubt, to you, but..." Camp laughed. "Well, yes. To me it seemed wonderful at first, no doubt. But now, great God! But we will do great things yet. This idea came to me first at Chesilstowe." "Chesilstowe?" "I went there after I left London. You know, I dropped medicine and took up physics. Well, I did. Light fascinated me." "Ah, optical density. The whole subject is a network of riddles." I was 22 and full of enthusiasm, and I said, "I will devote my life to this." You know what fools we are at 22. "Fools then, or fools now," said Camp. "I began to work, like a slave, and I had hardly worked and thought about the matter 6 months before light came suddenly. I found a general principle of pigments and refraction, a formula, a geometrical expression involving 4 dimensions. Fools, common men, even common mathematicians, do not know anything of what some general expression may mean to the student of molecular physics. In the books that Tramp has hidden, there are marvels, miracles. But this was not a method. It was an idea that might lead to a method by which it would be possible, without changing any other property of matter, to lower the refractive index of a substance, solid or liquid." "Phew," said Camp. "That's interesting. But still, I don't see quite... I can understand that thereby you could spoil a valuable stone, but personal invisibility was far." "Precisely," said Griffin. "But consider, visibility depends on the action of the visible bodies on light. Either a body absorbs light, or it reflects or refracts it, or does all these things. If it neither reflects nor refracts nor absorbs light, it cannot be visible. You see a red box, for instance, because the color absorbs some of the light and reflects the rest, all the red part of the light, to you. If it did not absorb any particular part of the light, but reflected it all, then it would be a shining white box. Do you understand? Some kinds of glass would be more visible than others. A box of very thin common glass would be hard to see in a bad light, because it would absorb hardly any light, and refract and reflect very little. And if you put a sheet of common glass in water, it would vanish, because light passing from water to glass is only slightly refracted or reflected. It is almost as invisible as coal gas or hydrogen is in air. And for precisely the same reason." "Yes," said Camp. "That is clear. And here is another fact you can't deny. If a sheet of glass is smashed, Camp, and beaten into a powder, it becomes much more visible while it is in the air. It becomes at last an opaque white powder. If the white powdered glass is put into water, it forthwith vanishes. The powdered glass and water have much the same refractive index. Yes, yes, said Kemp. But a man is not powdered glass. No, said Griffin. He is more transparent. Nonsense. That from a doctor. Have you already forgotten your physics in 10 years? Just think of all the things that are transparent and seem not to be so. Paper, for instance, is made up of transparent fibers, and it is white and opaque only for the same reason that a powder of glass is white and opaque. And not only paper, but cotton fiber, linen fiber, wool fiber, woody fiber, and bone, kemp, flesh, hair, nails, and nerves. In fact, the whole fabric of a man, except the red of his blood and the black pigment of hair, are all made up of transparent, colorless tissue. Most fibers of a living creature are no more opaque than water. Great heavens! Cried Kemp. Of course. I was thinking only last night of the sea larvae and jellyfish. Now you understand me. And all that I knew and had in mind a year after I left London, 6 years ago. Oliver, my professor, was a scientific bounder, a journalist by instinct, a thief of ideas. He was always prying. And you know the knavish system of the scientific world. I simply would not publish and let him share my credit. I went on working. I got nearer and nearer making my formula into an experiment, a reality. I told no living soul because I wanted to become famous. And suddenly, by accident, I made a discovery in physiology. Yes? You know the red coloring matter of blood? It can be made white, colorless, and remain with all the functions it has now. Kemp gave a cry of incredulous amazement. The invisible man rose and began pacing the little study. I remember that night. It was late at night. In the daytime one was bothered with silly students, and I worked then sometimes till dawn. It came suddenly, splendid, and complete in my mind. I was alone. The laboratory was still. In all my great moments I have been alone. One can make an animal, a tissue, transparent. One can make it invisible. All except the pigments. I can be invisible, I said. It was overwhelming. I stared out of the great window at the stars. I can be invisible, I repeated, and had a magnificent vision of all that invisibility might give to a man. The mystery, the power, the freedom. Just think. And I, poor young man, teaching fools in a provincial college, may suddenly become... And I worked 3 years. A provincial professor, always prying, silly students. And after 3 years of secrecy, I found that to complete it was impossible. Why? Asked Kemp. Money, said the invisible man, and went again to stare out of the window. He turned around abruptly. So I robbed my old father. The money was not his, and he shot himself. Chapter 20. At the house in Great Portland Street. For a moment Kemp sat in silence, staring at the back of the headless figure at the window. Then he started, rose, and took the invisible man's arm. You are tired, he said. Have my chair. He placed himself between Griffin and the nearest window. Griffin sat silent, and then he resumed abruptly. I had left the Chesilstowe cottage already when that happened. It was last December. I had taken a room in London, a large unfurnished room in a house near Great Portland Street. The room was soon full of the instruments I had bought with my father's money. The work was going on successfully. I went to bury my father. I remember the funeral, the cheap hearse, the scant ceremony, and the old college friend of his who read the service over him, a shabby, black old man. I remember walking back to the empty house, through the place that had once been a village. I remember myself as a gaunt black figure, and the strange sense of detachment I felt. I did not feel sorry for my father. He seemed to me to be the victim of his own foolish sentimentality. But going along the high street, my old life came back to me. For I met the girl I had known 10 years since. Our eyes met. Something moved me to talk to her. She was a very ordinary person. Re-entering my room seemed like the recovery of reality. They were the things I knew and loved. I will tell you, Kemp, sooner or later, all the complicated processes. We need not talk about that now. For the most part, they are written in those books that Tramp has hidden. We must get those books again. My first experiment was with a bit of white wool fabric. It was the strangest thing in the world to watch it fade like a wreath of smoke and vanish. I could scarcely believe I had done it. I put my hand into the emptiness, and there was the thing, as solid as ever. I threw it on the floor. I had a little trouble finding it again. And then came a curious experience. I heard a meow behind me, and turning, saw a lean white cat, very dirty, outside the window. A thought came into my head. "Everything is ready for you," I said, and went to the window, opened it, and called it softly. The cat came in, purring. The poor beast was starving, and I gave her some milk. All my food was in the cupboard in the corner of the room. The invisible rag upset the cat, but I gave the cat some butter. "And you—" "Yes, but the process failed." "Failed?" "I gave the beast opium and put the cat in the pillow it was sleeping on the apparatus. And after all the rest had faded and vanished, there remained 2 little eyes." "Interesting. I can't explain it. The cat was bandaged and clamped, of course. But it woke and meowed dismally, and someone came knocking. It was an old woman from downstairs who suspected me of vivisecting. 'Did I hear a cat?' she asked. 'My cat? Not here,' said I very politely. She was a little doubtful and tried to peer into the room. Bare walls, uncurtained windows, the gas engine, and 2 radiant points. She was satisfied at last, and went away again. "How long did it take?" asked Kemp. 3 or 4 hours, the cat. I stopped the gas engine, set the cat free, and left it sleeping on the invisible pillow, and went to bed. I found it hard to sleep. About 2 o'clock, the cat began meowing. I tried to hush it by talking to it, and then I decided to drive it away. I remember the shock I had when there were just the round eyes shining green, and nothing round them. I wanted to give it milk, but I hadn't any. The cat just sat down and meowed at the door. I tried to catch it, but it vanished. Then it began meowing in different parts of the room. At last, I opened the window. I suppose it went out at last. I never saw the cat any more. Then, heaven knows why, I began to think of my father's funeral again. After that, I wandered out into the morning streets. "So the invisible cat walks in the city," said Camp. "If it hasn't been killed," said the invisible man. "Why not?" "Why not, indeed," said Camp. "It's very probably been killed," said the invisible man. "It was alive 4 days after, I know, because I saw a crowd trying to see whence the meowing came." He was silent again, then he resumed abruptly. "I remember that morning before the change very vividly. It was a sunny day in January. One of those sunny, frosty days that came before the snow this year. I was apathetic, and I tried in vain to recover the enthusiasm of my first inquiries. But the fixed idea still ruled me. I tried to think of all the fantastic advantages an invisible man could have in the world. And there was someone rapping at the door. It was my landlord with threats and inquiries, an old Polish Jew in a long grey coat. I had been tormenting a cat in the night, he was sure. The old woman told him already. He insisted on knowing all about it. The laws in this country against vivisection were very severe. I denied everything. He came into the room, peering about over his spectacles, and a sudden idea came into my mind. He might learn something of my secret. He began to ask, what was I doing? Why was I always alone and secretive? Was it legal? Was it dangerous? I told him to get out. He began to protest. In a moment I threw him out. I slammed and locked the door, and sat down quivering. I became very angry and active. I hurried out with my 3 books of notes, my checkbook, the tramp has them now, and directed them from the nearest post office to a house of call for letters and parcels in Great Portland Street. I tried to go in noiselessly. Coming in, I found my landlord going quietly upstairs. You would have laughed to see him jump aside. He glared at me as I went by him, and I set to work. It was all done that night. While I was still sitting and working, there came a repeated knocking at the door. It ceased, footsteps went away and returned, and the knocking was resumed. There was an attempt to push something under the door, a blue paper. I rose and went, and flung the door wide open. "What do you want?" said I. It was my landlord. He lifted his eyes to my face. For a moment he gaped. Then he cried, dropped candle, and went down the dark passage to the stairs. I shut the door, locked it, and went to the looking glass. Then I understood his terror. My face was white, like white stone. But it was all horrible, a night of racking anguish, sickness and fainting. Luckily I lived alone. There were times when I sobbed and groaned. Then the pain had passed. I thought I was killing myself, and I did not care. I shall never forget that dawn and the strange horror of seeing that my hands had become as glass, and watching them grow clearer and thinner. My limbs became glassy. The bones and arteries faded, vanished. I stood up. I was weak and very hungry. I went and stared at nothing in my looking glass. By a frantic effort of will, I dragged myself back to the apparatus and completed the process. Then I went to sleep. About midday, I was awakened by a knocking. My strength had returned. I sat up and listened and heard a whispering. I sprang to my feet and began to detach the connections of my apparatus. I opened the window. As the window opened, a heavy crash came at the door. Someone was trying to smash the lock. I began to tremble. Heavy blows began to rain upon the door. I stepped out of the window and sat down on the roof, secure and invisible. They opened the door and stood in the doorway. It was the landlord and his 2 stepsons. Behind them was the old witch from downstairs. You may imagine their astonishment to find the room empty. One of the younger men rushed to the window at once, flung it up and stared out. He stared right through me, so did the others as they joined him. The old man went and peered under the bed. A feeling of extraordinary elation took the place of my anger as I sat outside the window and watched these 4 people. They were trying to understand the riddle of my behavior. The old man agreed with the old lady that I was a vivisectionist. The sons protested that I was an electrician. I came into the room again and went softly downstairs. I went into one of the sitting rooms and waited until they came down. Then I slipped up again with a box of matches, fired my papers and rubbish, and left the room for the last time. "You fired the house!" exclaimed Kemp. Yes, I fired the house. I was invisible, and I was only just beginning to realize the extraordinary advantage my invisibility gave me. Chapter 21. In Oxford Street. In going downstairs the first time, I found an unexpected difficulty because I could not see my feet. Indeed, I stumbled twice. By not looking down, however, I managed to walk passably well. I was excited. I felt as a seeing man in a city of the blind. I wanted to jest, to startle people, to clap men on the back. But when I had come to Great Portland Street, I was hit violently behind, and turning, saw a man carrying a basket of soda water siphons. I laughed aloud. "The devil's in the basket," I said, and suddenly twisted it out of his hand. But a stupid cabman rushed there, and his fingers took me under the ear. I hurried straight across the road, which was happily clear. But while walking, I was sometimes bruised severely. It was a bright day in January, and I was naked, and the thin slime of mud covered the road was freezing. Then suddenly a bright idea came into my head. I got into the cab. And so, shivering, scared, and sniffing, and with the bruises, I drove slowly along Oxford Street. This invisibility indeed! I was cruelly chilled, and a little white dog began to follow me. I had never realized it before, but the nose for a dog is the eyes for a man. Dogs perceive the scent of a man moving. This brute began barking and leaping. I went away from the dog very fast. Then I heard some music, and looking along the street saw the crowd. The people were chanting in the roadway and scoffing on the pavement. I ran up the wide steps of a house facing the museum, and stood there until the crowd had passed. 2 urchins stopped by me. "Do you see them?" said one. "See what?" said the other. "The footmarks, bare." I had looked down and saw the youngsters had stopped and were gaping at the muddy footmarks I had left behind me on the newly whitened steps. "Somebody went up the steps," said the boy, "and he did not come down again. And his foot was bleeding." For a moment I was paralyzed. "It's a ghost," said the elder. He outstretched his hand. In another moment he would touch me. Then I saw what to do. I made a step, and with a rapid movement I swung myself over into the portico of the next house. But the smaller was shouting out that the feet had gone over the wall. They rushed round and saw my new footmarks on the lower step and upon the pavement. "What's up?" asked someone. "Feet, look! Feet are running!" I rushed headlong, with 6 or 7 astonished people following my footmarks. There was no time for explanation. Twice I doubled round corners, thrice I crossed the road, and then, as my feet grew hot and dry, the footmarks began to fade. This running warmed me to a certain extent, but my back had now become very stiff and sore, my tonsils were painful, and the skin of my neck had been scratched. I had caught a cold and was sneezing, and every dog was a terror to me. Then I saw a mass of black smoke streaming up above the roofs and telephone wires. It was my lodging burning. My clothes, my apparatus, all my resources, except my checkbook and the 3 volumes of memoranda that awaited me in Great Portland Street, were there, burning. I had burned my boats. The invisible man paused and thought. Camp glanced nervously out of the window. "Yes?" he said. "Go on." Chapter 22. In the Emporium. So last January, with the beginning of a snowstorm in the air, I began this new life. I had no refuge, no appliances, no human being in the world in whom I could confide. To tell my secret would make a mere show of me. My object was to get shelter from the snow, to get myself covered and warm. But to me, an invisible man, the houses of London stood latched and barred. And then I had a brilliant idea. I found myself outside the department store, you know the place, meat, grocery, linen, furniture, clothing, paintings even, a huge collection of shops rather than a shop. I entered and walked down the shop. I wanted to rob the place for food and clothing, perhaps sleep on a bed. That seemed an acceptable plan. My idea was to get clothing, to get money, and then to recover my books and parcels where they awaited me. Then I would take a lodging somewhere and elaborate plans for the complete realization of the advantages my invisibility gave me, as I still imagined. Closing time arrived quickly enough. I was really surprised to observe how rapidly the young men and women whipped away the goods displayed for sale during the day. Then came a lot of youngsters carrying pails and brooms, and at last came a noise of locking doors. Silence came upon the place, and I found myself wandering through the vast and intricate shops and galleries alone. My first visit was to the place where I had seen socks and gloves for sale. It was dark, and I was looking for the matches, which I found at last in the drawer of the little cash desk. Then I had to get a candle. At last, I managed to find out what I sought. Pants, socks, trousers, a jacket, an overcoat, and a hat. I began to feel a human being again, and my next thought was food. Upstairs I got cold meat, there was coffee, and I lit the gas and warmed it up. I came upon a grocery section with a lot of chocolate and candied fruits, and some white wine. I knew that was a toy department, and I had a brilliant idea. I found some artificial noses, dummy noses, you know, and I thought of dark spectacles. Finally, I went to sleep in a heap of quilts, very warm and comfortable. I thought that I should be able to slip out unobserved in the morning with my clothes upon me, and with the money I had taken, spectacles, and so forth, and so complete my disguise. I lapsed into disorderly dreams of all the fantastic things that had happened during the last few days. I saw the ugly little landlord vociferating in his rooms. I saw his 2 sons, and the wrinkled old woman's gnarled face as she asked for her cat. Then I came round to my father's open grave. "You also," said a voice, and suddenly they forced me towards the grave. I struggled, shouted, but they did their work well. I realized I was invisible and inaudible. I struggled in vain. Nobody saw me, nobody was aware of me. Then I awoke. I sat up, and I could not understand where I am at the moment. Then, as recollection came back to me, I heard voices. I saw 2 men approaching. I scrambled to my feet, and the sound of my movement made them aware of me. "Who's that?" cried one. And "Stop there!" shouted the other. I dashed round the corner. Lying on the ground, I did not know what to do. I did not want to take off my clothes. "Here he is!" came a bawling. I sprang to my feet. The man was approaching. I took a flower pot and smashed it on his silly head. Then I made a mad rush for the restaurant, and there was a man in white, a cook. I went behind the counter, and I crouched down behind the counter and began whipping off my clothes as fast as I could. Coat, jacket, trousers, shoes, everything. "This way, policeman," I heard someone shouting. I stood panting and scared as the policeman and 3 of the shopmen came round the corner. "He must be somewhere here," said one of the men. But they did not find me. I went to another shop and drank a little milk I found there and sat down by the fire to consider my position. It was impossible to steal something from this store. About 11 o'clock, I decided that the department store was useless and went out, with only the vaguest plans of my future action. Chapter 23. In Drury Lane. "So you begin now to realize," said the invisible man, "the full disadvantage of my condition. I had no shelter, no clothing. To get dressed would mean to make myself strange and terrible. I ate very little, for to eat would mean to become visible again." "I never thought of that," said Kemp. "Nor had I. I could not go out in snow. It would expose me. Rain, too, would make me a bubble. I went into the slums towards Great Portland Street and found myself at the end of the street in which I had lodged. My most immediate problem was to get clothing. The day was cold. I walked fast. Every crossing was a danger. At last, I reached a dirty little shop near Drury Lane, with a window full of robes, sham jewels, wigs, slippers, and theatrical photographs. The shop was low and dark, and the house rose above it for 4 stories, dark and dismal. I peered through the window, and seeing no one within, entered. My plans were now definite. I wanted to get a wig, a mask, spectacles, and a costume. It was a queer little room, poorly furnished and with many big masks in the corner. I resolved to explore the house, and spend some time in doing so as noiselessly as possible. The house was very old and damp. Several rooms were unfurnished, and others were littered with theatrical lumber. In one room, I found a lot of old clothes. Suddenly I heard footsteps, and looking up, saw the householder holding an old-fashioned revolver in his hand. I stood perfectly still while he stared about. "It must have been her," he said slowly. "Damn her." He shut the door quietly, and immediately I heard the key turn in the lock. Then his footsteps retreated. I realized abruptly that I was locked in. For a minute I didn't know what to do. I walked from door to window and back, and stood perplexed. But I decided to inspect the clothes before I did anything further. That time, the householder came in again, actually touched me, jumped back with amazement, and stood astonished in the middle of the room. "Rats," he said. He was evidently a little scared. By this time I knew he was alone in the house, and I knocked him on the head. "Knocked him on the head?" exclaimed Kemp. "Yes, I hit him with a stool. He fell down like a bag of old boots. The point was, Kemp, that I had to get out of that house in a disguise without his seeing me. I couldn't think of any other way of doing it. And then I tied him up in a sheet." "Tied him up in a sheet?" "I made a sort of bag of it. It was rather a good idea to keep the idiot scared and quiet. My dear Kemp, it had to be done. He had his revolver. If he saw me, he would be able to describe me." "But," said Kemp, "the man was in his own house, and you were, well, robbing." "Robbing! You'll call me a thief next. Kemp, can't you see my position?" "And his too," said Kemp. The invisible man stood up sharply. "What do you mean to say?" "I suppose, after all," Kemp said with a sudden change of manner, "this had to be done. You had to do something, but still. Of course I had to do something, and that fool made me wild, hunting me about the house, bringing his revolver, locking and unlocking doors. You don't blame me, do you? You don't blame me." "I never blame anyone," said Kemp. "What did you do next?" "I was hungry. Downstairs I found a loaf and some cheese, more than sufficient to satisfy my hunger. I took some brandy and water. The fool was lying quite still. I went to the room containing the old clothes. Outside the day was bright, by contrast with the shadows of the dismal house in which I found myself. I began a systematic search of the place. Everything that could possibly be useful I collected, and then I made a deliberate selection. I found a handbag and some powder, rouge and plaster. I had thought of painting and powdering my face in order to render myself visible. Finally, I chose a mask, slightly grotesque, dark glasses, whiskers, and a wig. I could find no socks, but the fool's boots were rather sufficed. In a desk in the shop were 3 sovereigns and about 30 shillings, and in a locked cupboard in the inner room were 8 pounds in gold. I could go forth into the world again, equipped. Then I hesitated a little. Was my appearance really credible? I inspected myself from every point of view. It seemed passable. Then I unlocked the shop door and marched out into the street. No one was surprised seeing me. He stopped again. "And what about that householder?" asked Kemp. "I don't know," said the Invisible Man. "I have never heard what became of him. I suppose he untied himself finally." He became silent and went to the window and stared out. "What happened when you went out?" "Oh, disappointment again. I thought my troubles were over. I could take the money where I found it. I went to the restaurant and was already ordering lunch when it occurred to me that I could not eat. I will have to expose my invisible face. I told the waiter I would be back in 10 minutes and went out. Disappointment." "I can imagine it," said Kemp. "At last, I went into another place and demanded a private room. 'I am disfigured,' I said. 'Badly.' They looked at me curiously, but of course it was not their affair, and so at last I got my lunch. When I had it, I sat over a cigar, trying to plan my line of action, and outside a snowstorm was beginning. The more I thought it over, Kemp, the more I realized how helpless an invisible man was, in a cold and dirty climate and a crowded city. Before I made this mad experiment, I had dreamt of 1,000 advantages. That afternoon, it seemed all disappointment. I could not enjoy my invisibility. I am not interested in politics or fame or philanthropy or sport. What was I to do? What did I become invisible for?" He paused. "But how did you get to Iping?" asked Kemp. "I went there to work. I wanted to restore what I have done." "Did you go straight to Iping?" "Yes. I got my 3 volumes and my checkbook, my luggage and underclothing. I ordered the chemicals. I will show you the calculations as soon as I get my books. And then I started. At the end," said Kemp. "The day before yesterday, when they found you." "Yes." "Did I kill that fool of a constable?" "No," said Kemp. "He's expected to recover." "That's his luck, then. The fools! Why couldn't they leave me alone? And that idiot of a grocer?" "He is alive," said Kemp. "I don't know about that tramp," said the Invisible Man with an unpleasant laugh. "By heaven, Kemp, you don't know what rage is. To work for years, to plan, and then an idiot bother you. All the silly creatures of the world have been sent to me. If I meet more of them, I shall go wild. I shall start killing them. They've made things 1,000 times more difficult." "No doubt it's exasperating," said Kemp dryly. Chapter 24. The Plan That Failed. "Had you any plan?" asked Kemp with a side glance out of the window. "I was going to leave the country, but I have altered that plan rather since meeting you. Now the weather is hot and invisibility is possible. So I thought it would be wise to make for the south. My secret is known, and everyone will be looking for a masked and muffled man. There are a lot of steamers from here to France. Thence, I could go by train to Spain or to Algiers. It would not be difficult. A man might always be invisible there. I wanted to use that tramp as a money box and luggage carrier." "That's clear." "And the filthy brute has robbed me. He has hidden my books, Kemp. Hidden my books. If I can catch him." "It's better to get the books first." "But where is he? Do you know?" "He's in the town police station. He requested to be locked up in the strongest cell." "Cur," said the Invisible Man. "We must get those books. Those books are vital." "Certainly," said Kemp a little nervously, wondering if he heard footsteps outside. "Certainly, we must get those books. But that won't be difficult if he doesn't know they're for you." "No. said the Invisible Man, and thought. Kemp did not know what to say more, but the Invisible Man continued. "But now, Kemp," he said, "my plans are different. You are a man that can understand everything. In spite of all that has happened, in spite of the loss of my books, of what I have suffered, there still remain great possibilities, huge possibilities." Kemp was silent. "Have you told anybody that I am here?" the Invisible Man asked abruptly. Kemp hesitated. "No," he said. "No one," insisted Griffin. "Not a soul." "Ah," the Invisible Man stood up. "I made a mistake, Kemp, a huge mistake. I did everything alone. I have wasted strength, time, opportunities. How little a man can do alone. To rob a little, to hurt a little, and there's the end. What I want, Kemp, is a helper, and a shelter where I can sleep and eat and rest. I must have a confederate. With a confederate, with food and rest, 1,000 things are possible. We must consider all that invisibility means, and all that it does not mean. It's of little help in housebreaking and robbing. Once you've caught me, you could easily imprison me. But on the other hand, I am hard to catch. This invisibility, in fact, is only good in 2 cases. It's useful in getting away. It's useful in approaching. It's particularly useful, therefore, in killing." Kemp's hand went to his mustache. "Was that a movement downstairs?" "And it is killing we must do, Kemp." "It is killing we must do," repeated Kemp. "I'm listening to your plan, Griffin, but I do not agree. Why killing? Not wanton killing, but a judicious slaying. They know that there is an invisible man, and that invisible man, Kemp, must now establish a reign of terror. Yes, a reign of terror. He must take some town and terrify and dominate it. He must issue his orders, and all who disobey his orders he must kill, and kill all who would defend them." Said Kemp, no longer listening to Griffin, but to the sound of his front door opening and closing. "It seems to me, Griffin, that your confederate would be in a difficult position." "No one would know he was a confederate," said the Invisible Man eagerly. And then suddenly, "Hush! What's that downstairs?" "Nothing," said Kemp, and suddenly began to speak loud and fast. "I don't agree to this, Griffin. Understand me, I don't agree to this. How will you gain happiness? Don't be a lone wolf. Publish your results. Think what you might do with 1,000,000 helpers." The Invisible Man interrupted. "There are footsteps coming upstairs," he said in a low voice. "Nonsense," said Kemp. "Let me see," said the Invisible Man and advanced to the door. And then things happened very swiftly. Kemp hesitated for a second and then moved to intercept him. The Invisible Man started and stood still. "Traitor!" cried the voice, and suddenly the dressing gown opened and the unseen began to disrobe. Kemp made 3 swift steps to the door, and forthwith the Invisible Man sprang to his feet with a shout. Kemp flung the door open. As it opened, there came a sound of hurrying feet downstairs and voices. With a quick movement, Kemp thrust the Invisible Man back, sprang aside, and slammed the door. The key was outside and ready, but as Kemp slammed the door, the key fell noisily upon the carpet. Kemp's face became white. He tried to close the door with both hands. Then the door opened a little, but he got it closed again. The second time it was jerked a foot wide. Kemp's throat was gripped by invisible fingers. He was forced back heavily into the corner. Colonel Addy, the recipient of Kemp's letter, the chief of the Burdick police, was staring aghast at the sudden appearance of Kemp, followed by the extraordinary sight of clothing. He saw Kemp rush forward and go down again. Then suddenly he was struck violently, by nothing. Invisible feet passed downstairs, and the front door of the house slammed violently. "My God!" cried Kemp. "He's gone!" Chapter 25. The Hunting of the Invisible Man. "He is mad," said Kemp. "Inhuman. He is pure selfishness. He thinks of nothing but his own advantage, his own safety. I have listened to his story this morning. He has wounded men. He will kill them unless we can prevent him. Nothing can stop him. He's going out now, furious.
He must be caught, said Addie. That is certain.
But how? Cried Kemp, and suddenly became full of ideas. You must begin at once. You must prevent his leaving this district. Once he gets away, he may go through the country as he wills, killing and maiming. He dreams of a reign of terror. A reign of terror, I tell you. We must watch the trains and roads and ships. The army must help. The only thing that may keep him here is his books. Listen. There is a man in your police station, Marvel.
I know, said Addie.
I know. Those books, yes. But the tramp. He says he doesn't have them, but he thinks the tramp has. And you must prevent him from eating or sleeping. Day and night the country must be astir for him. Food must be locked up and secured. Heaven send us cold nights and rain. The whole country must begin hunting.
I tell you, Addie, he is a danger, a disaster.
It is frightful to think of the things that may happen.
What else can we do? Said Addie.
I must go down at once and begin organizing. But you come too. It's urgent. What else is there we can do?
In another moment, Addie was leading the way downstairs.
They found the front door open and the policeman standing outside staring at empty air. He's got away, sir, said one.
We must go to the central station at once, said Addie.
One of you go down and get a cab to come up and meet us, quickly. And now, Kemp, what else? Dogs, said Kemp. Get dogs. They don't see him, but they wind him. Get dogs.
Good, said Addie.
Dogs. What else? Remember, said Kemp. His food is seen. After eating, his food is seen until it is assimilated, so that he has to hide after eating. And put all weapons away. He can't carry such things for long.
We shall get him, said Addie.
And on the roads, said Kemp and hesitated.
Yes, said Addie.
Powdered glass, said Kemp. It's cruel, I know. But think of what he may do.
It's unfair. I don't know, said Addie.
This man has become inhuman, I tell you, said Kemp. I am sure he will establish a reign of terror, if we don't catch him. But we must be ahead. Chapter 26. The Wicksteed Murder. The Invisible Man had rushed out of Kemp's house in a state of blind fury. A little child playing near Kemp's gateway was violently caught up and thrown aside, so that its ankle was broken. No one knows where the Invisible Man went, nor what he did after that. He was exasperated by Kemp's treachery. He had counted on Kemp's cooperation in his brutal dream. In the morning, he had still been simply a legend, a terror. In the afternoon, he was presented as a tangible antagonist, to be wounded, captured, or killed. The police began to work fast. By 2 o'clock, even the Invisible Man might get aboard a train, but after 2, that became impossible. Every passenger train traveled with locked doors, and in a great circle of 20 miles round Port Burdock, men armed with guns and bludgeons, with dogs, were patrolling the roads and fields. Policemen were stopping at every cottage and warning the people to lock up their houses and keep indoors, unless they were armed. All the schools had closed by 3 o'clock, and the children, scared, were hurrying home. Before nightfall, a thrill of horror went through the whole nervous countryside. Going from mouth to mouth, passed the story of the murder of Mr. Wicksteed. Of course, we know nothing of the details of that murder. It occurred on the edge of a gravel pit. Everything points to a desperate struggle, the trampled ground, the numerous wounds Mr. Wicksteed received, his splintered walking stick. But why the attack was made, it is impossible to imagine. Mr. Wicksteed was a man of 45 or 46, the very last person in the world to provoke such a terrible antagonist. Against him, the Invisible Man used an iron rod dragged from a piece of fence. He stopped this quiet man, going quietly home, attacked him, broke his arm, and smashed his head to a jelly. One can imagine that the Invisible Man was trying to avoid discovering his presence in the neighborhood, and Wicksteed, excited and curious, was pursuing him. No doubt the Invisible Man could easily go away, but the fact is, he killed poor Wicksteed. Anyway, this is pure hypothesis. The only undeniable facts are the discovery of Wicksteed's dead body and of the blood-stained iron rod. After the murder of Mr. Wicksteed, the Invisible Man went towards the hills. There is a story of a voice heard about sunset by a couple of men in a field.
It was wailing and laughing, sobbing and groaning.
As the evening advanced, the fields became dotted here and there with groups of 3 or 4 men, and noisy with the yelping of dogs. These hunters had particular instructions in the case of an encounter, but he avoided them all. In the morning, the Invisible Man was active, powerful, angry, and malignant again, prepared for his last great struggle against the world. Chapter 27. The Siege of Kemp's House. Kemp read a strange missive, written in pencil on a greasy sheet of paper. "You are energetic and clever," this letter ran. "Though I cannot imagine what you want, you are against me. For a whole day you have chased me, you have tried to rob me of a night's rest, but I have had food in spite of you. I have slept in spite of you. And the game has just begun. The game has just begun. I must start the terror. This announces the first day of the terror. Port Burdock is no longer under the Queen. Tell your colonel of police and the rest of them. It is under me, the terror. This is day 1 of year 1 of the new epoch, the epoch of the Invisible Man. I am Invisible Man the first. To begin will be easy. The first day there will be one execution, a man named Kemp. Death starts for him today. He may lock himself away, hide himself away, get guards about him, put on armor if he likes. Death, the unseen death, is coming. Let him take precautions. The game begins. Death starts. Help him not, my people, lest death fall upon you also. Today, Kemp is to die. Kemp read this letter twice. "It's no hoax," he said. "That's his voice, and he will act." He turned the sheet over and saw the postmark, Hintondene. He got up slowly, leaving his lunch unfinished, and went into his study. He rang for his housekeeper and told her to go round the house at once, examine all the fastenings of the windows, and close all the shutters. He closed the shutters of his study himself. From a drawer in his bedroom, he took a little revolver, examined it carefully, and put it into the pocket of his jacket.
He wrote some brief notes, one to Colonel Addy, gave them to his servant.
"There is no danger," he said, and added, "to you." Then he returned to his lunch. He struck the table sharply. "We will get him," he said, "and I am the bait." He went up to the belvedere, carefully shutting every door after him. "It's a game," he said. "An odd game, but the chances are all for me. Mr. Griffin, in spite of your invisibility. Griffin against the whole world." He stood at the window, staring at the hillside. He must get food every day, and I don't envy him. Did he really sleep last night? I wish we could get some cold, wet weather instead of the heat. He may be watching me now. He went close to the window. Something rapped smartly against the brickwork over the frame. He started violently back. "I'm getting nervous," said Kemp. "It must have been a sparrow." Presently he heard the front door bell ringing and hurried downstairs. He unbolted and unlocked the door and opened it cautiously without showing himself. A familiar voice hailed him. It was Addy. "Your servant's been assaulted, Kemp," he said. "What?" exclaimed Kemp. "That note of yours was taken away from her. He's here. Let me in." Addy entered. The note was snatched out of her hand. It scared her horribly. "She's at the police station. Hysterics." "What was it about?" Kemp swore. "What a fool I was," said Kemp. "I might have known. It's not an hour's walk from Hintondene. Already."
"What's up?" said Addy. "Look here," said Kemp, and handed Addy the Invisible Man's letter. Addy read it and whistled softly. "He'll run away," said Addy. "No," said Kemp. A smash of glass came from upstairs. "It's a window, upstairs," said Kemp and went up. There came a second smash while they were still on the staircase. When they reached the study, they found 2 of the 3 windows smashed. The 2 men stopped in the doorway, contemplating the wreckage. Kemp swore again. As he did so, the 3rd window was smashed. "What's this for?" said Addy. "It's a beginning," said Kemp. "There's no way of climbing up here.
Not for a cat, said Kemp. No shutters. Not here, all the downstairs rooms. Smash, and then wax came from downstairs. Confound him, said Kemp. This must be one of the bedrooms, but he's a fool. The glass will fall outside. He'll cut his feet. Another window was smashed. The two men stood perplexed.
Let me have a stick or something, said Addie.
And I'll go down to the station and get the bloodhounds. You haven't a revolver. Kemp's hand went to his pocket. Then he hesitated. Only one.
I'll bring it back, said Addie. You'll be safe here.
Kemp handed him the weapon.
In another moment, Addie was on the doorstep.
He hesitated for a moment. Then he marched down the steps. He crossed the lawn and approached the gate. Something moved near him. Stop, said a voice.
Addie stopped, and his hand tightened on the revolver. Well, said Addie, white and grim.
Go back to the house, said the voice.
The voice was on his left front, Addie thought.
Where are you going? Asked the voice.
Where I go, Addie said slowly, is my own business.
The words were still on his lips when an arm came round his neck. His back felt a knee, and he was sprawling backwards. He fired, and in another moment he was struck in the mouth, and the revolver was taken from him.
Damn, said Addie.
The voice laughed.
Addie saw the revolver in the air, 6 feet off. Well, said Addie, sitting up.
Get up, said the voice.
Addie stood up.
Attention, said the voice, and then fiercely. Don't try any games. Remember, I can see your face, and you can't see mine. Go back to the house.
He won't let me in, said Addie.
That's a pity, said the invisible man.
Addie moistened his lips.
He looked at the little metal thing hanging between heaven and earth, 6 yards away. What am I to do? He said sullenly. And what am I to do? Asked the invisible man. You will get help. The only thing is for you to go back. I will try.
Kemp had hurried upstairs, and now, peering cautiously from the window, he saw Addie stand, talking to the unseen.
Why doesn't he fire? Whispered Kemp to himself. Then the revolver moved a little, and the glint of the sunlight flashed in Kemp's eyes.
Surely, he said, Addie has given up the revolver. Addie turned towards the house, walking slowly with his hands behind him. Kemp watched him. The revolver vanished, flashed again into sight, vanished again, and became evident as a little dark object following Addie. Then things happened very quickly. Addie leapt backwards, swung around, clutched at this little object, missed it, threw up his hands, and fell forward on his face. Kemp did not hear the sound of the shot. Addie writhed, raised himself on one arm, fell forward, and lay still.
He lay on the lawn near the gate. Then came a ringing and knocking at the front door, but Kemp's servants had locked themselves into their rooms. This was followed by a silence. Kemp went to the staircase and stood listening. He armed himself with his bedroom poker. Everything was safe and quiet. He returned to the Belvedere.
Addie lay motionless over the edge of the gravel just as he had fallen.
The housemaid and 2 policemen were coming along the road by the villas. Everything was still. The 3 people were approaching very slow. Kemp wondered what his antagonist was doing. He started. There was a smash from below. He hesitated and went downstairs again. Suddenly, the house resounded with heavy blows and the splintering of wood. He turned the key and opened the kitchen door. As he did so, the shutters, split and splintering, came flying inward. He stood aghast. The shutters had been driven in with an axe. Suddenly, the axe leapt aside and vanished. He saw the revolver lying on the path outside, and then the little weapon sprang into the air. Kemp slammed and locked the door, and he heard Griffin shouting and laughing. Then the blows of the axe were resumed. Kemp stood in the passage trying to think. In a moment the invisible man would be in the kitchen. This door would not keep him. A ringing came at the front door. Policemen? Kemp ran into the hole and drew the bolts. The 3 people came into the house, and Kemp slammed the door again. The invisible man, said Kemp. He has a revolver, with 2 shots left. He's killed Addie. Didn't you see him on the lawn? He's lying there. Who? Said one of the policemen.
Addie, said Kemp.
We came in the back way, said the girl. What's that smashing? Asked one of the policemen. He's in the kitchen. Or will be. He has found an axe. The girl stared towards the kitchen, shuddered, and retreated into the dining room. They heard the kitchen door open. This way, said Camp, and bundled the policeman into the dining room doorway. Poker, said Camp, and rushed to the fender. He handed the poker he had carried to the policeman, and the poker from the dining room to the other. He suddenly flung himself backward. Whoop, said one policeman, and caught the axe on his poker. The revolver snapped its penultimate shot. The second policeman brought his poker down on the little weapon and sent it to the floor. The axe receded into the passage and fell to a position about 2 feet from the ground. They could hear the invisible man breathing. Stand away, you two, he said. I want that man Kemp. We want you, said the first policeman, making a quick step forward and wiping with his poker at the voice. The invisible man started back and hit the policeman with the axe. The helmet crumpled like paper, and the blow sent the man to the floor. But the second policeman, aiming behind the axe with his poker, hit something soft. There was a sharp exclamation of pain, and then the axe fell to the ground. The policeman put his foot in the axe and struck again. Then he heard the dining room window open and a quick rush of feet. His companion sat up, with the blood running down between his eye and ear. Where is he? Asked the man on the floor. I don't know. I've hit him. He's standing somewhere in the hall. Dr. Kemp, sir? Pause. Dr. Kemp, cried the policeman again. The second policeman stood up. Suddenly, the pad of bare feet on the kitchen stairs could be heard. Yup, cried the first policeman and flung his poker. First he wanted to pursue the invisible man downstairs. Then he changed his mind and stepped into the dining room. Dr. Kemp, he began. The dining room window was wide open, and neither housemaid nor Kemp were seen. Chapter 28. The Hunter Hunted. Mr. Heelis, Mr. Kemp's nearest neighbor, was asleep in his summer house when the siege of Kemp's house began. Mr. Heelis refused to believe in all this nonsense about an invisible man. His wife, however, did. He slept through the smashing of the windows and then woke up suddenly, looked across at Kemp's house, rubbed his eyes, and looked again. Then he put his feet to the ground and sat listening. The house looked as though it had been deserted for weeks after a violent riot. Every window was broken, and every window was blinded by the internal shutters. And then, as he sat open-mouthed, came the very strange thing. The shutters of the drawing-room window were flung open violently, and the housemaid in her hat and garments appeared. Suddenly, a man appeared beside her, helping her. Dr. Kemp. In another moment, the window was open, and the housemaid pitched forward and vanished among the shrubs. Mr. Heelis saw Kemp stand on the sill, spring from the window, and reappear running down the slope towards Mr. Heelis. Lord, cried Mr. Heelis, it's that invisible man. It's right, after all. Mr. Heelis bellowed like a bull. Shut the doors, shut the windows, shut everything. The invisible man is coming. Mr. Heelis ran himself to shut the windows that opened on the veranda. In another moment, Kemp was running across the tennis lawn to the house. You can't come in, said Mr. Heelis, shutting the bolts. I'm very sorry if he's after you, but you can't come in. Kemp appeared with a face of terror, rapping and then shaking frantically at the window. Then, seeing his efforts were useless, he ran along the veranda and went to hammer at the side door. Then he ran round by the side gate to the front of the house. After that, Mr. Heelis witnessed Kemp vanish, so the rest of the chase was beyond his purview. Kemp ran well for a man out of training, and though his face was white and wet, his wits were very cool. For the first time in his life, Kemp discovered that the hill road was indescribably vast and desolate. The people below were staring at him, one or two were running. The Jolly Cricketers was noisily barring its doors. Kemp resolved to go for the police station. Kemp heard the swift pad of his pursuer and leapt forward again. The invisible man! He cried to the navvies and leapt the excavation. Then, abandoning the idea of the police station, He turned into a little side street, hesitated for the 10th of a second at the door of a shop, and then ran again. 2 or 3 little children were playing here. They shrieked and scattered at his apparition. He glanced up the street towards the hill. Hardly a dozen yards off ran a huge navvy, and behind him came the conductor. Up the street, others followed these two, striking and shouting. Down towards the town, men and women were running. Camp suddenly grasped the situation. He stopped and looked around. "He's close here!" he cried. He was hit hard under the ear. He just managed to keep his feet, and he struck in the air. Then he was hit again under the jaw and sprawled headlong on the ground. In another moment, an knee compressed his diaphragm, and a couple of hands gripped his throat, but the grip of one was weaker than the other. Camp grasped the wrists, heard a cry of pain from his assailant, and then the spade of the navvy came whirling through the air above him and struck something. The grip at Camp's throat suddenly relaxed, and with a convulsive effort, Camp loosed himself. He gripped the unseen elbows near the ground. "I've got him!" screamed Camp. "Help! Help! He's here! Hold his feet!" Then came a mighty effort, and the invisible man threw off a couple of his antagonists and rose to his knees. The conductor suddenly got the neck and shoulders. Then suddenly, a wild scream was heard. "Mercy! Mercy!" "Stand back, you fools!" cried Camp. "He's hurt! Stand back!" The people saw the doctor kneeling and holding invisible arms. "Don't let him go!" cried the big navvy, holding a blood-stained spade. "He's shamming." "He's not shamming," said the doctor, raising his knee. "And I hold him." His face was bruised, his lip was bleeding. "The mouth's all wet," he said, and then, "Good God!" He stood up abruptly and then knelt down on the ground by the side of the unseen man. People now were coming out of the houses. "He's not breathing," Camp said, and then, "I can't feel his heart." Suddenly, an old woman screamed sharply. "Look there," she said. And looking where she pointed, everyone saw, faint and transparent, the outline of a hand. "Oh!" cried the constable. "And his feet!" And so, slowly beginning at his hands and feet, that strange change continued. It was like the slow spreading of a poison. First came the little white nerves, then the glassy bones and intricate arteries, then the flesh and skin. Presently, they could see his crushed chest and his shoulders. Then everyone saw the bruised and broken body of a young man about 30. His hair and brow were white, and his eyes were like garnets. His hands were clenched, his eyes wide open, and his expression was one of anger and dismay. "Cover his face," said a man. "For God's sake, cover that face." Someone brought a sheet from the Jolly Cricketers, and having covered him, they carried him into that house. And there it was, on a shabby bed, in a tawdry bedroom, surrounded by a crowd of ignorant and excited people, broken and wounded. That Griffin, the first of all men to make himself invisible. Griffin, the most gifted physicist the world has ever seen, finished his strange and terrible career. The Epilogue. So ends the story of the strange and evil experiments of the Invisible Man. And if you would learn more of him, you must go to a little inn near Port Stowe and talk to the landlord. The landlord is a short and corpulent little man with a nose of cylindrical proportions. Drink generously, and he will tell you generously of all the things that happened to him after that time, and of how the lawyers tried to take money from him, the money found upon him. "They couldn't say whose this money was," he says. "And then a gentleman gave me a guinea a night to tell the whole—" And if you want to stop the flow of his reminiscences, you can always do so by asking if there were 3 manuscript books in the story. He admits there were and proceeds to explain that everybody thinks he has them, but he hasn't. The Invisible Man took them to hide them. These are Mr. Kemp's fakes. And then he watches you furtively and leaves the bar. He's a bachelor, and there are no women in the house. His movements are slow, and he's a great thinker. And on Sunday mornings, every Sunday morning, all the year round, while he's close to the outer world, and every night after 10, he goes into his bar parlor and locks the door and even looks under the table. And then he unlocks the cupboard and the box in the cupboard and a drawer in that box, and produces 3 volumes bound in brown leather and places them solemnly in the middle of the table. The landlord sits down in the armchair, fills a long clay pipe slowly. Then he pulls a book towards him and opens it, and begins to study it, turning over the leaves backwards and forwards. His brows are knit, and his lips move painfully. 6, 2, cross, and a small hook. Lord, great intellect! Full of secrets, wonderful secrets. Only the landlord knows the books have been the secret of invisibility, and a dozen other strange secrets written therein, and none other will know of them until he dies.
Subscribe to the channel and give a thumbs up.